So here's why you made it here today. So, Historical Wounds, Present Realities by Andrea French. This training explores the concept of historical trauma, its lasting impact on American Indian and Alaskan Native communities. Participants will gain an understanding of what historical trauma is, including the collective and intergenerational experiences that have shaped Native communities over time. And so, our wonderful speaker today, if you could go to the next slide for me, is Andrea French. She is a social worker with experience in child welfare and community behavioral health. She's previously held the position of project director, where she successfully managed a system of care grant program and coordinated initiatives in trauma informed care. Additionally, she has worked in a state and tribal child welfare social work as a tribal child well, what are words? My coffee's kicking in. It's making my brain try and work faster than my mouth. Tribal child welfare social worker, emphasizing culturally sensitive practices and fostering collaboration with tribal communities. Currently, Andrea serves as a training and technical assistant specialist at the National Native Children's Trauma Center, where she continues to advocate for the well being of Native children and families through comprehensive training and support initiatives. And so, Andrea, this is the reason why we're here today. So, you can go ahead and take it away.
Right. Thank you, Casey. And I see, Tanis, you have your hand raised. Did you have a question before we get started?
I do not. I'll try to lower that somehow. Oh,
Okay.
there we go. Thank you, though.
All right.
Thank
Just
you.
wanted to make sure we checked in with you before we get started here.
Thank you.
All right. So as Casey shared, you're here today for the Historical Wounds and Present Realities presentation. And before we fully get started, I want to open in a good way. So let us begin by honoring the Creator, Mother Earth, and all our relations, seen and unseen. We give thanks for the land beneath our feet, the air in our lungs, and the waters that sustain us. May our hearts open with humility and our minds remain curious. Grant us the courage to recognize our own biases, the wisdom to listen deeply, and the compassion to walk gently with one another. And as we gather in the spirit of learning, strengthen our capacity for respect and reciprocity, let each story shared and every question asked be a step towards true understanding and partnership. May our time together honor the strength of our communities, past and present, and may the teachings we receive guide us to serve with integrity and cultural humility. We offer this in gratitude with an open heart. Hanmatakiapi, Chante Washtea Napachiu Zapiro. Hello, my relatives. I greet you all with a warm heart. My name is Andrea French, and I serve as a training and technical assistant specialist for the National Native Children's Trauma Center at the University of Montana. I'm Fort Belknap, Nakota, Santee, Dakota, Turtle Mountain, Chippewa, and Plains Cree. Both of my maternal grandparents were raised on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in northeastern Montana. In the 1950s, they were relocated to Butte, Montana area and eventually made their forever home in Polson, Montana. And that's the photo that's in the background here. My family relocated again after my sophomore year of high school, this time to the Potawatomi Indian Reservation in Mayetta, Kansas, where I graduated from high school. As a light-skinned Native student, I had some unique and challenging experiences that shaped my understanding of identity and visibility within our communities. After high school, I started at the University of Kansas with the intention of becoming a lawyer, but I found the size of the university didn't offer the kind of support I needed. I eventually transferred to Haskell Indian Nations University, where I felt a stronger sense of belonging and cultural connections. I earned my Bachelor of Arts in American Indian Studies from Haskell and went on to complete a master's degree in social work at the University of Washington in Seattle. I've lived in Washington State for nearly 12 years now and have worked in both state and tribal child welfare programs. Most recently, I worked on a tribal system of care under a SAMHSA grant before joining the team at the University of Montana. My primary focus in this role is on wraparound care and trauma healing within our tribal communities. And today I live near the Yakima Indian Reservation with my husband, who is an enrolled member of the Yakima Nation, and that's where my last name comes from. And we're raising our 3 children, who are 2, 3, and 6 years old. I share all of this to lift up the truth that many Native families like mine are shaped by relocation, intertribal connection, and living outside of their ancestral territories. Our identities are woven through these lived experiences, and our presence, wherever we are, is part of a much larger story of Indigenous resilience and continuity. And then I saw a couple of things in the chat. Oh, Margie, you're from Lawrence. Awesome. I miss it. Okay. And as I shared, I work with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. It's a specialized training and technical assistance center located in Missoula, Montana, at the University of Montana. We're proud to serve as a Category 2 center within the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, or NCTSN. Our team includes both Missoula-based and remote staff across multiple states, which allows us to build meaningful partnerships and extend our reach to tribal communities throughout the country. At the heart of our work is a commitment to trauma-focused healing that is culturally grounded and community-led. We collaborate by invitation only, honoring the sovereignty and self-determination of Native communities. When invited, we support community efforts to deepen understanding of trauma, strengthen local capacity, and promote sustainable healing strategies that reflect each community's unique strengths and values. As you can see here, these are the incredible staff members that I get the pleasure of working with, and we make up the Native Children's Trauma Center. Our staff bring diverse lived experiences, professional backgrounds, and cultural knowledge to the work of supporting tribal communities in healing from trauma. And many of our team members are Native professionals, parents, educators, clinicians, and community leaders, each bringing their deep commitment to the vision of trauma-informed, culturally grounded care for Native children and families. And before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that today's content may bring up some difficult emotions. We'll be discussing trauma, including historical and intergenerational trauma, which can serve as a reminder of our own lived experiences or those of people we care about. It's completely normal to feel unsettled, emotional, or even unexpectedly triggered during these conversations. If at any point you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, please do what you need to take care of yourself. Whether that means stepping away for a moment, reaching out to someone you trust, or engaging in a calming or grounding practice. If these feelings don't subside, please do seek support. You can talk to a trusted friend, community member, or a mental health professional. And you can also access immediate support by texting the crisis line or visiting the website. Oops. And you can always call or text that crisis line at 988. Please know that you're not alone and your well-being is really important throughout our time together as well as afterwards. And before we dive again into today's content, we want to take a moment to establish some of those group agreements. These are intended to create a safe, respectful, and supportive space for everyone participating today. First, we ask that everyone to approach this conversation with respect, and we may come from different backgrounds, identities, and lived experiences, but we share a commitment to understanding the impacts of trauma and supporting healing in our communities. Next, we encourage curiosity over judgment. If you hear something unfamiliar or challenging, lean into learning rather than reacting, and ask questions with a spirit of openness. Let's also remember to practice non-disclosure. While you're welcome to share your own reflections, please don't share other people's stories or comments outside of this space. And finally, I invite you to engage and care for yourself and for others. If you need to take a break, step away, or ground yourself, please do so. This is emotionally sensitive material, and we want everyone to feel supported. These agreements help us co-create a space where real dialogue and learning can happen and where healing conversations can unfold. So here's a quick overview of where we're headed today. We'll start by defining historical, intergenerational, and transgenerational trauma and how these show up in Native communities. Then we'll explore personal and collective experiences of historical trauma among American Indian and Alaska Native individuals. And we'll also identify 3 current impacts of historical trauma, followed by a look at 2 culturally grounded healing strategies that communities are using today. Finally, we'll highlight protective factors, those strengths that support resilience in Native youth and families. And this session's both informative and reflective, so we invite you to walk this journey with us and openly participate. So as we begin today, we want to ground ourselves in who we are and beyond our job titles or our roles. Each of us carries a unique mix of family stories, values, traditions, and lived experiences. And when we take the time to reflect on those, we set the stage for meaningful learning and connection. So in this activity, we're going to reflect quietly and then connect in small groups and finally return together to share some of our insights. So first, I want to ask you to write, sketch, or think about the following questions. Who are you beyond your job or title? What are 3 words that describe your identity? What family, cultural, or community traditions have shaped you? And what parts of your identity are evolving, emerging, or being reclaimed? And also, what gives you a sense of belonging? And we'll give you about 5 minutes to sit and think about this, and then we'll go into some breakout rooms. Alrighty, welcome back. So you guys are all filtering in. And thank you for participating. Hopefully it was some really great discussion and sharing for this morning. All right, we still have some more people coming back. All right, like everybody's back now. So I'm gonna ask that in the chat, if you can share one word or phrase that stood out to you in your reflection or in your group. And also, what are you carrying forward with you from this activity? Nice. Connection, openness, community and family, strength, boundaries, learning and growing, resilience. Nice. A shout out to Erin. Yeah, lots of connection, resilience, and strength. So I'm still figuring it out. Yep. It's a lifelong journey for self-identity, right? All right. Let me move my videos. So I want to really, truly thank you for engaging with this reflection. Identity is really personal, layered, and powerful. And when we begin to see who we are, we create space for deeper empathy and shared understanding. As we move forward today, hold on to what grounds you. We'll begin exploring how systems and policies have shaped identity and experience in our Native and tribal communities, but it's important to start with our own stories first. So again, in the chat, can you share how does your community think and talk about trauma and resiliency? Or is it even talked about in your communities? Yeah. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, some communities don't talk about it. It's about a 50-50. Not a big deal. Yeah. a difficult conversation or topic. Yeah. All right. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it is. It's a pretty difficult topic to bring up. Personally, I think some people are scared to dive into it. Um, and yeah, it's more common amongst social service programs and behavioral health programs from what I've seen. So yeah, thank you for sharing that in the chat. The way we talk or don't talk about trauma and healing tells us so much about our culture, our survival, and our strength. And these responses help remind us that while historical trauma has left deep wounds, our communities have always carried practices of resilience, remembrance, and repair. So, why talk about historical trauma? Historical trauma is the deep soil from which many present day challenges in Native communities have grown. It stems from generations of collective harm, systemic oppression, forced assimilation, and cultural erasure. These experiences didn't end in the past. They continue to impact health, identity, and resilience today. Often, this history is dismissed with phrases like just move on, while other traumas are honored with never forget. That contrast highlights whose pain is validated and whose is overlooked. But we know that acknowledging historical trauma is essential to healing. It allows us to honor truth, foster understanding, and create space for meaningful change. Native communities continue to demonstrate powerful resilience, drawing on culture, tradition, and shared strength to heal. When we apply a historical trauma lens to our work, we gain deeper insight, ask better questions, and respond in ways that truly support healing for individuals, families, and their communities. This slide represents one of the most personal and painful aspects of historical trauma, the deep wounding of identity, spirit, and belonging. The term soul wound comes from the work of Eduardo and Bonnie Duran and others, who describe historical trauma not just as physical harm, but as a spiritual injury, one that affects individuals, families, and entire nations at the core of who they are. This image is a powerful representation of that trauma. For many Indigenous people, our hair holds deep cultural and spiritual significance. The act of cutting a child's braid during boarding school wasn't just about appearance, it was a symbolic severing of connection to culture, family, and self. And this was one of many acts meant to erase our identities. These were not isolated incidents, they were part of that bigger systemic effort to remove Native identity, spirituality, language, and a traditional knowledge. That's why we refer to this as a set of traumas, layered and repeated across generations. Understanding historical trauma in this way helps us see that the harm wasn't just physical, it reached into the soul and it continues to ripple outward in ways we must acknowledge if we want to support true healing in our communities. And now that we've introduced historical trauma as that deep generational wound, we'll look more closely at some of those other primary elements. These next 2 points come from the work of Walters and colleagues, who offer a clear framework to understand how this trauma functions and persists. The second element of historical trauma is that it's shared by a group of people who hold a specific group identity, in this case, American Indian and Alaska Native identity. The trauma doesn't happen in isolation. Instead, it's experienced collectively by families, communities, and entire tribal nations. That shared experience creates not just a pattern of harm, but a collective memory of trauma that lives on through stories, silence, and inherited emotional pain. The third element is that this trauma is often tied to genocidal or ethnocidal intent. In other words, the harm wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. This includes things like boarding schools, relocation policies, broken treaties, and other forced assimilation efforts that aim to erase culture, language, and spiritual practices. These weren't just unfortunate byproducts of history, they were part of intentional strategies to destroy or fundamentally alter Indigenous peoples and our lifeways. By naming both of these elements, collective impact and deliberate intent, we make space for truth-telling. These experiences aren't just difficult chapters in the past, they're active threads in the lives of our people today. Understanding this helps us move beyond surface level trauma work and toward deeper, culturally informed healing. And the fourth element of historical trauma is that it spans multiple generations. This means that the effects of trauma aren't just experienced by those who lived through these events directly. They are passed down through families and communities over time. Moha and colleagues described this as transgenerational transmission of trauma, which shows up in both visible and invisible ways. For example, we might see intergenerational patterns of grief, parenting challenges, substance use, or disconnection from cultural identity. But we may also see inherited silence, stories that were never told, pain that was never named, and teachings that were interrupted or lost. And it's important to be clear, this is not about blaming families or genetics. This is about recognizing that when trauma isn't addressed or when systems actively prevent healing, it gets carried forward. Sometimes it gets internalized, and other times reenacted or often misunderstood. But this also means that healing can be passed down too. When we break silences, reconnect with culture, or rebuild relationships, we interrupt that cycle. We create opportunities for new generations to carry strength instead of pain. So understanding that historical trauma spans generations is critical, not just for context, but for guiding how we respond, support, and heal moving forward. This quote powerfully captures the lived experience of unresolved historical grief, a deep emotional burden that many Native people carry, often without knowing exactly why or where it comes from. The woman says, "I feel like I've been carrying a weight around that I've inherited. I never knew where it came from." That feeling is something many people resonate with when they begin to connect their personal pain to collective historical trauma. It's not just individual, it's inherited, held in the body and often passed down through silence, absence, or unspoken sorrow. She continues, "I feel a sense of responsibility to undo the pain of the past. I can't separate myself from the past, the history, and the trauma." That's an incredibly honest reflection. For many Indigenous people, the past isn't distant, it's present. It shows up in parenting, in relationships, in health, and in community dynamics. When grief is not acknowledged or processed, it doesn't just disappear. As Braveheart and De Bruin emphasize in their work, this unresolved historical grief can become paralyzing, not only for individuals, but for entire communities. It can affect our ability to trust, to connect, to heal, and to move forward. And naming this grief is an act of resistance. It's a step towards healing. And as we continue this conversation, we'll talk about how healing can take root through culture, community, and collective care. So this slide outlines 3 distinct but connected types of trauma: historical, intergenerational, and transgenerational trauma. Understanding the differences and their connections between them helps us better respond with empathy, accuracy, and cultural awareness. So let's begin with historical trauma. It's a concept deeply shared by the work of Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, a Lakota scholar and clinician. She defined historical trauma as the cumulative psychological wounding across generations resulting from massive group trauma. Her groundbreaking work drew powerful comparisons between the experiences of Jewish Holocaust survivors and the experiences of the Lakota people, highlighting that trauma doesn't end with the generation who lived through it. It's carried forward. This brings us to intergenerational trauma, the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next. This often happens when parents or caregivers carry unresolved grief, fear, or disconnection, and unintentionally pass those patterns down through parenting, communication, or silence. The trauma is lived in the present, even if its origins are in the past. Transgenerational trauma goes that step further. It refers to the trauma experienced by descendants who were not directly exposed to the original traumatic event, such as grandchildren or even great-grandchildren. This newer term acknowledges the long-term ripple effects of trauma and how they can persist in families and communities over many generations. Together, these concepts remind us that historical trauma is not just an event, it's an inheritance. But if trauma can be passed down, so can healing. And part of that healing starts with understanding how these forms of trauma function and show up today. So this timeline offers an overview of key eras in federal Indian policy, tracing a pattern of evolving but often still harmful approaches the US government has used in its treatment of Native nations. While we'll explore each era more deeply in the next slides, it's important to recognize that these shifts weren't just policy changes. They shaped the lived experiences of Native people across generations. And according to the legal scholar Stephen Pavar, whose work in the rights of Indians and tribes provides a foundational understanding of federal Indian law, US policy has historically followed a cycle of control, disruption, and partial restoration. Policies have ranged from forced removal to assimilation to termination, and more recently towards self-determination. But even the more recent eras still exist with a system built on a long history of broken promises and systemic harms. This isn't just legal or historical theory, it's part of collective memory many Native people carry today. Families were displaced, children were institutionalized, and ceremonies were outlawed, and the language was stripped away. These policies weren't experienced in isolation, they compounded over time, deepening the trauma while also setting the stage for resilience and resistance. So when we talk about historical trauma, this timeline helps us see that it wasn't a single event. It was a continuum of policies, often with intentional disruption of Native sovereignty, identity, and survival. And as we move forward, we'll walk through each era, naming not only the harm, but also the strength and cultural continuity that persisted through it all. So before colonization, Native nations were sovereign and thriving, with rich systems of governance, trade, education, spirituality, and culture. These weren't scattered or undeveloped societies. They were organized, knowledgeable, and deeply rooted in the land. Many tribes welcomed early settlers and entered into formal treaties with them, built on concepts of mutual respect, shared space, and diplomacy. These agreements recognized tribal sovereignty and self-determination, at least in writing. However, over time, that respect was replaced with conquest. Land was taken, treaties were broken, and wars were waged. The US government and European powers shifted their approach from coexistence to domination. European introduced diseases devastated tribal communities, causing massive population loss, with some communities losing over 90% of their people. Alongside disease, displacement, enslavement, and outright violence further destabilized Native nations. And yet, tribal nations were not passive in the face of these changes. Native leaders negotiated, resisted, and protected their people, and they adapted. In fact, tribal governance models like the Iroquois Confederacy even influenced the structure of the US Constitution, though that contribution is often overlooked in mainstream society. Despite the violence and loss of this era, Native families showed resilience, unity, and survival. These are the same strengths we see carried forward today. Evidence that even in the face of historical trauma, Indigenous knowledge, kinship, and sovereignty remain. Following the Revolutionary War, the newly formed United States recognized tribes as sovereign nations, much like Britain had done before independence. At that time, early US leaders, including Thomas Jefferson and Henry Knox, publicly affirmed that tribal nations had independent authority and should be treated as foreign nations, capable of entering into binding agreements. During this period, the US signed treaties with tribes like the Delaware Nation to define land rights, hunting areas, and mutual responsibilities. These treaties were meant to establish peaceful coexistence and were considered legally binding documents between equals. Congress even passed early laws to protect tribal lands and limit exploitation by traders and settlers. And it's important to note that during this era, many tribal nations were still militarily strong, politically organized, and able to negotiate from a position of power to protect their territories. However, the good faith of these treaties was quickly undermined. Despite legal protections, settlers continued to encroach on tribal lands, and the federal government consistently failed to enforce the treaties or stop the land theft. Eventually, even leaders like Jefferson, who had once affirmed tribal sovereignty, began to advocate for the removal of tribes to make way for that westward expansion. This marked a clear shift in U.S. policy from diplomacy and treaty making to dispossession and forced removal. This era reminds us that the roots of historical trauma are not just in violence, but also in broken promises, treaties that were signed and then ignored. And these betrayals still shape Native perspectives on government, law, and land today. This era marks one of the most devastating and traumatic chapters in U.S. federal Indian policy. After years of signing treaties, the U.S. government shifted its strategy from treaty making to outright removal. The goal became clear: remove Native people from their ancestral lands to make way for that white settlement. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which led to the forced relocation of entire tribal nations from the southeastern U.S. to lands west of the Mississippi River. This included the Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations, and among 34 other tribes. The Cherokees' journey became known as the Trail of Tears, during which thousands died from exposure, starvation, and disease. Tribes were relocated to what was called Indian Territory, now in present-day Oklahoma, often under pressure and through deceptive or coercive treaties. At the same time, gold discoveries and westward expansion led settlers to invade tribal lands, and the federal government largely failed to stop these incursions, leading to violent conflict and massacres. To break tribal resistance, the U.S. government destroyed the bison, a vital resource for many of our plains tribes. This wasn't just ecological destruction, it was a calculated strategy to starve Native people into submission and force them onto reservations. By the late 1800s, federal policy expanded its reach to Native children. Families were forcibly separated as children were taken to federal boarding schools, like Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where they were punished for speaking their language, practicing their culture, or even using their own names. Many children never returned home, and the impacts of those schools are still felt today. And in 1871, Congress officially ended treaty making with tribes, marking a shift in how the federal government viewed tribal nations, not as sovereign partners, but as wards of the state, stripping them of their recognized legal and political status under U.S. law. This era set the foundation for long-lasting trauma and disconnection, but it also marks a turning point in the erasure of tribal autonomy and identity, a history that still affects how systems engage with Native families today. In 1887, the U.S. government passed the General Allotment Act, more commonly known as the Dawes Act, which marked a significant shift in federal policy, from removal and relocation to forced assimilation. The Dawes Act broke up communally held tribal lands and redistributed them as individual allotments to Native families, usually 80 to 160 acres per household. Any land deemed surplus after these allotments was sold off to white settlers, often without tribal consent or compensation. This policy was framed as a reform effort, but it was deeply rooted in greed and a desire to erase tribal identity. The goal was to civilize Native people by turning them into farmers, mimicking Euro-American lifestyles and destroying communal landholding systems, which were central to tribal governance and cultural life. In practice, the Dawes Act was devastating. Most allotments were on land that was unfarmable, and Native families often lacked the tools, training, or capital to succeed. When families couldn't afford taxes or were pressured into selling, they lost their land, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes through foreclosure or coercion. The consequences were enormous. Between 1887 and 1934, tribal land holdings plummeted from 140 million acres to fewer than 50 million. That's a loss of over 90 million acres, land that had once sustained communities for generations. And although U.S. citizenship was granted to Native people in 1924, this did not resolve poverty, racism, or the legacy of land theft. In fact, citizenship was offered without addressing the structural harms or returning land. It was another layer in a policy of forced assimilation. This era is a clear example of how systemic policies, not individual choices, dismantled tribal land bases and fractured communities. And it helps us understand the economic and cultural barriers that our people still face today. By the late 1920s, it was clear, even the federal government, that even to the federal government, that the policies of allotment, land theft, and forced assimilation had caused devastating harm to Native communities. In 1928, the Merriam Report officially acknowledged what tribes had long been saying. Conditions on reservations were marked by deep poverty, loss, and suffering, caused directly by federal Indian policy. In response, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, or the IRA, in 1934. This marked a significant shift in federal policy, a move away from assimilation and toward restoring tribal sovereignty. The IRA ended allotment, halted further breaking up of tribal lands, and allowed unsold surplus lands to return to tribal control. It also protected existing tribal lands, offering a small but important step toward land recovery. For the first time in generations, tribes were encouraged to rebuild systems of self-governance, adopt tribal constitutions, and begin reestablishing their economies. The IRA also protected Native religious and cultural practices and officially ended forced assimilation policies like those tied to boarding schools. In addition, the IRA allowed tribes to access federal funding for infrastructure, healthcare, housing, and education. And significantly, the Bureau of Indian Affairs began hiring Native people into leadership roles, a step towards honoring tribal voice in federal systems. While the IRA was far from perfect and didn't address land loss or restore full tribal autonomy, it was the first federal policy in over 100 years that aimed to support tribal survival and renewal, rather than dismantle it. This era represents the beginning of a long road back to self-determination, but also reminds us how deeply federal policy shapes the daily lives, governance, and well-being of tribal nations. So despite the shift towards the tribal self-governance during the Indian Reorganization era, by 1953, the U.S. government had once again returned to a policy of assimilation and control, this time through termination. Congress passed House Resolution 108, which explicitly called for ending the federal trust relationship with tribes as rapidly as possible. This meant cutting off services, dissolving tribal governments, and eliminating legal recognition of tribes altogether. As a result, 109 tribes were terminated, stripped of their federal recognition, sovereignty, and land rights. Over 2.5 million acres of tribal land were taken out of trust status, and entire communities lost legal and economic protections. Public Law 280 passed in the same era and gave several states authority over criminal jurisdiction on reservations, which undermined tribal sovereignty and created confusion and overreach in legal systems, something many tribes are still working to unwind today. The federal government also launched the Urban Relocation Program, offering job training and incentives to Native people to move from reservations to the city. But many who relocated faced broken promises as well. They arrived to find discrimination, poor housing, lack of support, and disconnection from their family, culture, and their communities. The impacts were devastating. Termination and relocation led to widespread poverty, educational decline, health disparities, and a profound loss of identity for Native people. Communities that had already endured generations of displacement were now dealing with legal erasure and cultural fragmentation. Even today, the legacy of termination continues to shape policy, tribal and federal relationships, and the community's memory. For many Native people, the fear of tribal erasure is not theoretical. It's a lived and deeply felt reality. In 1968, U.S. Indian policy shifted again, this time towards tribal self-determination. After decades of harm caused by termination and relocation, the federal government began to publicly recognize the inherent right of Native nations to govern themselves and preserve their identities. Since that time, most U.S. presidents, from Lyndon Johnson to Joe Biden, had supported tribal sovereignty and autonomy. That said, there have been setbacks recently, including rollbacks of tribal protections and land. Termination was officially denounced, and many tribes that had lost federal recognition during that era had their status restored. From this point forward, a series of major laws helped lay the groundwork for tribal self-governance. The Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 gave tribes the authority to manage their own education, their healthcare, and other services they needed. The Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978 aimed to stop the removal of Native children from their communities and protect tribal families. Federal acts improved healthcare and housing access on reservations. And the Violence Against Women's Act restored tribal jurisdiction to protect Native women and children from abuse. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, of 1990 helped return sacred items and ancestors to their rightful homes. In more recent years, policies under the Obama administration expanded tribal land and strengthened consultation rights between tribes and the federal government. The appointment of Deb Haaland, a Laguna Pueblo woman, as Secretary of the Interior was a historic milestone and a symbol of hope for many of our Native communities. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Native communities were hit especially hard, but also showed tremendous resilience during this time. Federal relief through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan helped fund healing, infrastructure, and recovery efforts. This era isn't without its challenges, but it represents the most consistent federal support for tribal survival, renewal, and sovereignty in over a century. It reminds us that healing requires not only community strength, but also structural accountability and change. So as we look at this slide, it's important to recognize that these are not just historical concepts. These are real traumas that some of our communities have faced and have been directly impacted by. Each of these examples represents a deliberate effort to displace, erase, or control Indigenous people through structural violence and policy. Genocide, including the massacres and military campaigns, was aimed at exterminating entire Native nations. Disease, often introduced through colonization, wiped out vast portions of tribal populations, sometimes intentionally through biological warfare. Starvation was used as a weapon, especially when food sources like the bison were intentionally destroyed to break that tribal resistance. Physical and sexual violence occurred during colonization, boarding schools, and military conflicts, often with impunity and silence. Other forms of trauma were systemically embedded in policy, forced removal and relocation that we've gone over, physical and sexual violence. I'm repeating myself now. Boarding schools, which aimed to kill the Indian and save the man, separating children from families, and erasing language and culture. Then there were the broken treaties that are not just the historical documents. They represent a pattern of deception, land theft, and broken trust by the US government. And then separation of families didn't stop with boarding schools. It continued through the child welfare systems and continues to this day in some courtrooms and agencies. And some traumas were spiritual and legal. Criminalization of spirituality meant that ceremonies, songs, and sacred ways had to be hidden just to survive. Reservations, often established on the least fertile or livable land, were part of a strategy of containment and control. This slide is a visual reminder of the layers of trauma Native communities have endured, not as isolated incidents, but as systemic, interlocking forces that shaped every aspect of life. But it also sets the stage for our next section, because despite all of this, Indigenous people have survived. And not only have we survived, We've resisted, adapted, and carried forward knowledge, healing, and culture, even through some of the harshest experiences. So I want to take a moment to settle into this slide. I want you to imagine something very real and something thousands of our Native families actually lived through. Imagine waking up one morning and your children are taken. You weren't warned, you didn't agree, and you have no idea where they've been taken. You don't know who's going to care for them or if they'll be safe. You don't know if they'll be warm at night, if they're going to be fed, if they'll be punished for crying or for speaking their language. And worst of all, you don't know if they'll ever come home to you. This was the devastating reality for many of our American Indian and Alaska Native families during the boarding school era. It wasn't ancient history, it happened just a few generations ago. Children were taken, families were torn apart, and entire communities were left with a grief that still lingers and remains. So I want to pause here to hold space for that truth. And now I'd like to invite you to respond in the chat, what feelings come up for you as you imagine that experience? What might it mean to carry that kind of loss for generations? And there's no right answer, just what's real for you in this moment. And you're welcome to share a word or phrase, or just simply take some time to reflect. So I'd kind of shared in the beginning about both of my grandparents, that they were raised on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. And both of my grandparents had, I guess what you would say, mixed blood. My grandfather was Assiniboine and Sioux, but he was also had Scottish bloodlines. And then my grandmother, who was Chippewa and Cree, she also had French bloodlines. And both of my grandparents they passed away. They've been gone for quite a few years now. And I wish I could go back and ask them, like, why didn't you have to go to boarding school? Because they had avoided that contact. My grandfather did have to finish. It was when he was in high school when they came to gather up the kids in his community to take them to boarding school. And they were able to negotiate that he goes to stay with a family member in Dodson, Montana, just off reservation, to finish high school. So he didn't have to go and travel. He would have been sent to Chilocco, Oklahoma at the time. And my grandmother was growing up in Zortman at the time, and she went to the mission school that was there. It was a day school, but she didn't have to go for residential school. However, I do have two aunts that are my mom's older sisters. They were 7 and 12 when they were sent to Flandreau Indian School. They deemed that my grandmother at that time couldn't take care of them. And so they were sent to Flandreau, South Dakota they lived in Wallace, Idaho at the time. So clear across the country. And both of my aunts finished school there in Flandreau. So they had a very different upbringing than my mother did. But yeah, when I think of this, as I shared in the beginning, I have 3 young children, and I couldn't imagine not knowing where they were, how they were cared for, and what they'd experience. And many of our grandparents and our great grandparents that did go to boarding school have only recently, in the past few years, started sharing about their experiences, started telling their stories, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Yeah, I had an uncle that went to Chilocco boarding school as well back in the 70s, late 60s, really. And he had lifelong friends that he had bonded with there too. Um, so yeah, everybody take a deep breath. I know those are some deep feelings to get into, and some of this next content is going to be a little bit hard to listen to. So please take a break um, if you need to. So, so this section that we're going to focus on is the boarding school era. In many conversations that I've had with colleagues, this was kind of that pivotal point of what really affected our communities. Removal and relocation was really hard. We lost a lot of people. But really, this boarding school era was what really hit our communities the hardest. And this photo on the page shows Native children at Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. It was one of the first federally funded off-reservation boarding schools in the United States. Carlisle became the model for hundreds of similar schools designed to assimilate Native children and erase their cultural identities. And we'll talk more about the system it created and the impacts it had in the slides that follow. So we're now going to watch this short video titled Source of the Wound. This animated piece was created by Native American Health Center, and it tells a powerful story about an experience when a child was taken away to boarding school. It captures those moments that are not often shown in textbooks about forced removal, emotional devastation, and the deep spiritual wound that comes from being separated from your family and your culture and your way of life. So as you watch, I invite you to imagine what it might have been like to be that parent or to be that child and to feel the weight of helplessness, fear, and some of the pain that they might carry for their lifetime. And another deep breath as we continue our journey talking about boarding schools. So now we'll talk about boarding school removal. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thousands of Native children were forcibly removed from their homes as part of the US government's assimilation policies. It was rooted in the belief that Indigenous identity was something to be erased, and these policies sought to solve what was referred to at the time as the Indian problem. Boarding schools were the primary tool of this effort, established and often run by religious groups, but federally funded. These institutions were not focused on education as we think of it today. They were designed to strip children of their culture, language, family, and connection to community. And one of the key architects of this system was General Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879. His infamous phrase, "kill the Indian in him and save the man," encapsulated the mindset behind these institutions. Carlisle became the prototype for for more than 350 schools across the US and Canada, including at least 12 in California. Attendance was often mandatory under federal law, and removal was not always peaceful. In some cases, child-size handcuffs like these were used to force children into compliance, and families who resisted risked fines, jail, or having all of their children taken. Once inside the schools, children endured systemic cultural erasure. Their hair was cut, traditional clothing was replaced with uniforms, and they were forbidden to speak their language or engage in spiritual or cultural practices. And many of these schools were structured like military institutions with drills, marching, strict rules, and punishment systems that extended far beyond discipline. However, this militarized model was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to control our children, suppress their identities, and increase conformity. It allowed the government and religious organizations to manage large numbers of children through fear, isolation, and surveillance. Survivor testimony tells us that the trauma extended far beyond lost language or missed childhood. Many endured physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual abuse, and schools were underfunded, overcrowded, and unsanitary. Malnutrition, illness, and neglect were widespread, and for many children, these schools were the last place they were ever seen. This is an ancient history. It's the impact of the system that's still alive in our Native communities today. We see it in the patterns of grief, in the silence that was passed down through generations, and in the deep work of healing that is still ongoing. And this is why historical trauma matters, not as a history lesson, but as a lens which we can better understand our experiences today. This image is one of the most well-known and haunting visual representations of the federal Indian boarding school era. On the left, we see a young Native man before attending Carlisle Indian Industrial School, dressed in his traditional clothing, wearing his hair long, carrying his identity, culture, and dignity. And then on the right, we see the same young man after attending Carlisle. His hair is cut, he's wearing a suit, his expression is more subdued, and much of what was once visually connected him to his culture has been removed. This image was used by the school as a promotional tool, a way to show funders and politicians that the boarding school system was working. To them, this transformation symbolized civilization. But to Native communities, this was a visual of forced assimilation, identity erasure, and cultural violence. It's important to recognize that the change shown here wasn't just about clothing or appearance. It was about trying to remove everything from where this young man came from. These before and after photos became part of a broader effort to justify policies designed to strip Indigenous people of their language, traditions, and sovereignty. And as we reflect on this image, we remember behind every after was someone who may have never fully found their way back to who they were. This next image is powerful and telling. In the background, you see one of the early federal Indian boarding schools. This one was located at Pine Ridge, South Dakota. It's large, institutional, and built, or sorry, it was large, institutional, and built to reflect Euro-American ideals of order, structure, and control. But what's just as important is what you see in the foreground. Families in teepees and wagons camped nearby. These were often parents and relatives, many of them desperate to stay close to their children after they were taken into the school. They weren't allowed inside. They weren't allowed to speak their language with their children, but they came anyway, camping outside the walls, hoping to catch a glimpse, to offer a prayer, or to simply be near them. And this photo captures the cultural collision that defined the boarding school era, the imposition of federal control against the resilience of Native families. It also reminds us of the truth that Native people never gave up on their children, even when systems tried to sever that bond. This is not just a historic photo, it's a window into the emotional and spiritual trauma of this era and the incredible strength of our Native families who endured it. In this map here, I know it's a little fuzzy to see. It was produced by the U.S. Department of the Interior as part of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. It shows the locations of more than 400 identified federal Indian boarding schools across the United States as of April 1st, 2022. Each dark blue dot represents a site where Native children were sent, many forcibly, to be assimilated into Euro-American society. These institutions were part of a federal system that operated from 1819 to 1969, with some continuing into the 1980s. You'll notice clusters in certain regions, especially across the plains, the Southwest, and the Great Lakes regions. Many of these sites were located far from children's home communities, which was intentional. The farther they were sent, the harder it was for families to visit or bring them back. The visual reinforces a painful truth. The boarding school system was not isolated or rare, it was widespread, coordinated, and deeply embedded in U.S. policy of the time. For many Native communities, these dots on the map represent lost languages, disrupted kinship, and enduring grief. But they also mark the beginning of truth-telling, accountability, and the hope for healing. This map zooms in on California, where at least 12 federal Indian boarding school sites have been identified. Some of the most well-known include Sherman Indian School in Riverside, originally known as Paris Indian School, and St. Boniface Indian School in Banning. These schools, like many others across the U.S., operated the goal of removing Native children from their families and assimilating them into Euro-American society. California's role in the system is often overlooked, but it was significant. These schools were scattered across both urban and rural parts of the state, from the far north to the southern border, and Native children were brought here from tribal communities across the state and even beyond. And what this map shows us is that this history is not far away. It's not distant in time or geography. It happened right here in the communities many of us live and work in today. And for Native families in California, the pain and impact of these institutions are still deeply felt. And I did see in the chat, someone mentioned that there was 2 boarding schools still open in California, and they are run by the Bureau of Indian Education under the Department of Interior. I've actually had quite a few of my high school classmates. They had gone there when they started high school and spent all 4 years there at Riverside or Sherman Indian School. We also have one here in Washington State. It's called Pascal Sherman Indian School, and they start taking children as young as 1st grade as a residential school. And some of the children are sent by their families, and then some of them are actually foster kids that had a hard time being placed. So we still see a lot of those systemic disruptions in our families today. And then here on this page, you're seeing the covers of Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report that was led by the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland. The first volume was released in May 2022. It was the first time in U.S. history that the federal government formally acknowledged the scope of its own involvement in the Indian boarding school system. It identified 408 federally supported boarding school institutions and 53 associated burial sites, many still unmarked and undocumented. The second volume, released just recently in July 2024, builds on the initial work by naming more than 98,000 Native children who were taken from their homes and sent to these schools. This volume also begins the work of mapping out where those children came from and where they were sent, confirming what Native communities have known and carried for generations. These reports are the result of years of advocacy by tribal nations, boarding school survivors, and the intergenerational relatives who fought for the truth, recognition, and justice. This work is ongoing, and it's not just about documenting the past, it's about truth telling as that pathway to healing. And for Dakota's question, yes, I believe the California mission system was also a part of the boarding school system. These federal Indian boarding school reports had requirements to count them as a boarding school. But if those missions or those religious institutions had received any federal funding, they would be a part of this list as well. Okay, and then those links are in the chat, and they still are online. The last I checked was on Monday. I've also saved them myself in PDF formats because I'm worried about them being taken offline. And it's valuable information for us to know. So this quote here is from Justice Neil Gorsuch in his concurring opinion in the 2023 U.S. Supreme Court case Holland versus Burkeen. It was a case that challenged the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act. When this court case was going on, most of Indian country was holding their breath to see what the outcome would be. But in this passage, he affirms what our Native communities have always known and endured for generations. By the late 1870s, the US government had fully shifted from that coexistence or treaty-making policy to a policy aimed at erasing tribal identity, and the explicit goal was to assimilate our Native children into white society. And to do that, officials believed that they had to sever all connections between children and their families, culture, and communities. And notice the language that was used at the time. Officials wrote that they needed the complete isolation of the Indian child from his savage antecedents, a phrase that reveals both the violence of the policy and the deep dehumanization behind it. Perhaps most chilling is the recognition that love was the threat. The warm reciprocal affection between parents and children was seen as an obstacle to assimilation. So federal policy was designed to dismantle our families because they were strong. This isn't a quote from 1880 or 1904. This was a sitting Supreme Court justice in 2023, confirming the intentional destruction of Native families as a matter of the federal policy. And it's a reminder that what we're discussing today isn't speculative or emotional. It's documented, acknowledged, and deeply woven into the legal and historical record of this country. And thank you guys for your continued comments. I'm trying to check through there in the chat to make sure that I'm not missing any questions that I could cover while we're going through these slides. So this slide shows some of those consequences of the adverse boarding school experiences. And the impact of that boarding school era didn't end when the doors of these institutions closed. The trauma carried by those who attended was passed down, and it had far-reaching effects on individuals, families, and entire communities. These schools deprived our children of nurturing environments, cultural guidance, and consistent models of healthy relationships. When children grow up in places where discipline replaces care, where language and love are withheld, it can change how they parent, connect, and relate to each other and to others. It also affects their identity, which is why I wanted to start today with that identity reflection in our groups, to share where your identities come from, where you're taught how to do things, where your sense of being comes from. So as we see here on this, in these boxes on the screen, this trauma can show up across this generation through patterns like ineffective or destructive parenting, authoritarian caregiving, emotional unavailability or insensitivity to children's needs, limited bonding or parental involvement, deep mistrust of school systems, disconnection from spiritual teachings and cultural identity, and then some unhealthy family dynamics and internalized shame. These are not signs of broken people. These are signs of survival in the face of disrupted systems. And for many of our families, the boarding school experience created a sense of grief that goes beyond that individual loss. It meant grieving your language, your community, roles, your sense of belonging. And in many cases, it left families questioning their worth after generations of being told that they were less than, incapable, or should be ashamed of who they were. Understanding these effects is essential because when we see these patterns in our work today and in our communities, we must remember they didn't start there, and healing won't happen without naming what came before. So this photo features Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, the first Native American to serve in a U.S. cabinet position, and our center director, Dr. Megan Rides at the door. It was taken during a stop on Secretary Haaland's Road to Healing tour. The Road to Healing was a national effort led by the Department of Interior to address the intergenerational trauma that was caused by the federal Indian boarding school system. Over the course of a year, Secretary Haaland traveled across the country to hold listening sessions with boarding school survivors and their families. These gatherings were sacred, emotional, and long overdue. Survivors shared stories of family separation, loss, abuse, and cultural erasure, and many of which had never been spoken aloud. The goal was not only to document these experiences, but to acknowledge them publicly and begin building a federal response rooted in truth and healing. And in Dr. Rides at the Door's blog post, The Road to Healing is a collective journey. It reflects on attending one of these sessions, and she reminds us that healing is not just personal, it's communal, cultural, and intergenerational. She writes about the importance of being witnessed, of reclaiming the narrative, and of leading our own healing paths as Native people. So together, this moment captured in the photo is a reflection of what's possible when federal systems show up with humility and when Native voices are centered in the healing process. And the quote from Dr. Rides at the Door was, "Healing is possible when our grief is witnessed, our truth is honored, and our future is supported." And you can see this blog post at our website. And then there should be a link for the blog post, and you'll be able to review the full thing there. And I can talk a little bit about the Orange Shirt Day as well. That was an initiative that was started, I believe the day is September 30th, to bring awareness to our relatives that had endured the boarding school system and some of those relatives that we had lost. really to bring that national awareness, so that people ask questions and see where it comes from. We also have another initiative in Indian country for our missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls, people. It's definitely evolved over the past few years. And that day is celebrated and recognized on, I shouldn't say celebrated, but recognized on May 5th across the country. Yeah. Um, Many communities will hold walks or hold events to bring that awareness and kind of bring that uplifting voice to the community. And locally here, the program that I worked for previously with Yakima Nation, we did Red Galia Day, which was on Thursdays, asking people to wear red or wear their red Galia shirt for the MMIW awareness. So every Thursday here in my community, you'll see a lot of people wearing a red shirt, whether it's the regalia shirt or the MMIW shirts, or even just a generic red shirt, to bring that awareness and get people to ask questions. So on that road to healing tour that Secretary Holland had taken, there were survivors that hadn't even spoken about their experiences in boarding school. And there's actually still a lot of our grandparents, aunts, and uncles that don't talk about their boarding school experiences because they grew up in a time period with that silent generation where you don't talk about it and you don't bring it up. So here's one of the survivor stories that was shared during that road to healing. And my grandpa was on a wagon and took our little suitcases off, my brother and and we got on. I got off the wagon to go get on the bus. My grandpa's last words were, "We're going to experience some things in Cheyenne." He was talking Cheyenne. "We're going to probably get our haircuts because a lot of our Cheyenne people got our haircuts." He said when they go away to school, he said, they get haircuts. He said our hair is very sacred. Culturally, our hair is sacred. We do not cut our hair, but they're going to do that to you. You get there, your black braids are not going to come home. And that was hard. My braids got cut off. Excuse me. Just remembering what happened to some of us the first day of school. And another survivor story that was shared at one of the Alaska meetings. I'll read this for you as well. I could just hear you could just hear crying. First, it would just start really slow, and then pretty soon you could hear the whole dorm crying. You'd hear girls saying they want to go home. And it was true. All our clothes were taken away from us, and we were given government issued clothing, and we were given numbers. You know, we were never called by our name. We were all called by our numbers. My number was 77 too, because my sister was there before me and her number was 76. And it was marked on everything you owned. So if that reminds you of some of the experiences that were parallel to the Jewish Holocaust survivors, and there's an overlap in history there because the reservation systems, when our tribal people were relocated, that was something that Adolf Hitler used as a model for his concentration camps, and the United States government used for their Japanese concentration camps and used for their current concentration camps today, or detention centers. So that's been kind of a reused ripple effect through many communities today. Yes, very wide sweeping dehumanization. That's a very great way to put it, Andrew. Thank you. So next we'll move into how all of this experience really affected our parent-child relationships. The experiences of our grandparents and our parents in boarding schools had that profound effect on their ability to parent according to their cultural practices and roles. Many were not exposed to positive parenting models and instead were subjected to those coercive or punitive parenting styles that were learned in the boarding school systems. These experiences, rooted in trauma, had led to feelings of shame, guilt, and remorse for past behaviors. For many, these emotions can resurface when they're reminded of their own traumatic memories from childhood. further complicating their ability to parent effectively. As a result, some parents struggle with emotional regulation, both in terms of managing their own emotions and responding to their children. This inability to regulate emotions can make it challenging to soothe their child, judge what's safe for their family, and respond in healthy ways to everyday stresses. In this context, we need to remember that these patterns are not innate, but they stem from the trauma of boarding school experience and other historical injustices and experiences in the past. So the good news is, after all of the sharing of this trauma history, that many of these traditional parenting practices in our communities are being revitalized as our communities work to restore so hard what was lost. However, parents may still feel shame or guilt about not knowing how to raise their children in culturally appropriate ways. This emotional burden can affect their interactions with their children and with others around them at times. Understanding this intergenerational trauma helps us see where we can intervene and how we can approach caregivers with empathy. When families come into our community programs, the behaviors we witness may have deep-rooted causes that are tied to these historical experiences. This helps us understand that the mistrust between our programs and our Native communities is not a simple issue. It's a product of a long history of trauma, and it's not a matter of if conflicts will arise, but when they will. So the question that we get to ask ourselves, how do we respond instead of reacting in these situations? Is there a way that we can better connect with and partner with these families in a way that acknowledges their history, respects their emotions, and provides the support they need to heal and thrive? And by approaching these families with understanding and compassion, trust, healing, and stronger connections will be built between our programs and our communities. This quote here reminds us of a powerful truth. The historical losses experienced by North American and Indigenous people are not historical in the sense that they happened long ago and a new life has begun. Rather, they're historical in that they originated long ago and have persisted. What this tells us is that historical trauma is not just something from the past, its impacts are woven into the present. The pain, the grief, and the disconnection that began generations ago are still being felt by families and communities today. And as we hold this truth, I invite us to think not just about the past, but about the present. How does historical trauma show up in our daily lives, in our communities, and in the systems we work in or rely on? And how can we begin or continue the conversations that allow space for truth and resilience today? These are not just questions for today, but for your tables, your teams, and your families. The more we talk about these legacies with honesty and care, the more we can begin to understand their impact and imagine something different for the future. So this is historical trauma showing up in many forms. There's unresolved grief, disenfranchised grief, and internalized depression. These are not just emotional responses, they are the psychological and spiritual consequences of the historical losses that Indigenous communities have endured for generations. These are the reminders of historical loss that remain ever present, represented by economic disadvantage on rural reservations, national disrespect, discrimination, and a sense of continual erosion of traditional cultures. These aren't just echoes of the past, these are present day realities, and many of our Native children, families, and communities are still navigating the compounded effects of trauma through poverty, systemic racism, poor educational access, and cultural disconnection. And yet, there's a sharp contrast in how different histories are remembered. Think of the phrase never forget in the context of 9/11. Now compare that to how Native history is often treated, how it's minimized, erased, or dismissed with phrases like get over it. That difference of how one group's trauma is honored while another's is denied adds another layer of pain. It invalidates Indigenous experiences and deepens the mistrust of many Native people and how they feel towards institutions, including our current systems, our healthcare systems, our human service systems, and even our educational systems. And this mistrust is not just about the past, it's about today's youth and today's communities. Our families may carry inherited grief, identity confusion, and that sense of disconnection. all while navigating these systems that don't fully see or support their reality. So we have to ask ourselves again, why keep moving forward as though history doesn't matter when we know it's still shaping how our Native youth and our communities experience the world? And when we acknowledge historical trauma, we make space for healing, for connection, and for relationships that are rooted in truth and mutual respect. And that's how we begin to break the cycle and support our Native families in a way that truly honors who they are and where they come from. So, one of the major impacts of historical trauma was the loss of those traditional ways of healing and balance. And many communities lost the knowledge keepers who provided ceremony, who provided our medicine, and who provided us support during times of grief or hardship. And without those cultural tools, managing trauma became more difficult. So today, ongoing stressors like poverty, limited access to care, and systemic racism continue to affect Native communities, leading to higher rates of substance use, violence, suicide, and mental health struggles. These aren't isolated problems, they're the compounded effects of that historical and present day trauma. But at the same time, I want to remind everyone that communities are working hard towards revitalizing traditional healing practices, bringing back our languages, our ceremonies, and our cultural care. But when trauma shows up and resources are scarce, the question becomes, how do people cope? And that introduces us to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. So many of you may have heard of this study, especially living in California. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACE study, which was groundbreaking research project that was done in the late 1990s. It asked over 17,000 adults, mostly white, middle-class patients in California who had health care, about 10 types of childhood adversity, including abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. The results showed something very powerful. The more adversity a person experienced in childhood, the greater their risk in life for things like heart disease, depression, substance use, and even early death. This study shifted national conversations around trauma, especially in schools, healthcare, and social services, but it also had a major limitation. It didn't account for historical or systemic traumas, things like colonization, racism, or intergenerational loss. So this is the expanded ACEs pyramid developed by the Rise Center, and it helps us understand trauma in a more complete and culturally relevant way. You may recognize the top portion of the pyramid that comes from the original ACE study, which showed how early trauma impacts health and well-being across a lifetime. It starts with adversity in childhood and builds towards disrupted development, risky behaviors, chronic health issues, and even early death. But what the Rise Center added, and what's so important for our Indigenous and other historically marginalized communities, is what you see at the base: social conditions and local context, like poverty, systemic racism, and community violence. And below that, generational embodiment and historical trauma, the layers of loss, oppression, and injustice that are inherited over time. This pyramid tells us a deeper truth, that trauma is not just personal, it's systemic and generational. What happens to a person doesn't start with them, it starts with the conditions they're born into, the history they inherit, and the systems they navigate. Understanding trauma this way helps us move away from what's wrong with you and toward what happened to you and to those who came before you. It also points to where healing must begin, not just with the individuals, but also at the roots. And this slide here shows the findings from multiple studies on adverse childhood experiences within the American Indian and Alaska Native communities across different age groups and regions, and we see consistently higher rates of childhood trauma. One study found that 97% of incarcerated Native individuals had at least one ACE, and over half had experienced child sexual abuse. In other studies, 75 to 83% of Native youth and adults reported at least one ACE, and many reporting multiple or severe exposures. These numbers reinforce what we already know. Historical trauma and current day stressors are deeply connected, and that they have real impacts on health, safety, and well-being. So with the mental health disparities we see today, like shorter life expectancy and higher trauma rates, they're not natural in our communities. They're the result of historical trauma combined with ongoing social and environmental stressors. And while healing is happening, it's important to recognize that it's not always easy. Cumulative grief, ongoing adversity, and chronic stress can make the healing process feel slow or even out of reach. So, as we move forward, we have to ask, how do we prevent ACEs from happening in the first place? That question is key to breaking cycles of trauma and building healthier futures, not just by addressing past wounds, but by actively creating environments where healing and safety are possible. So I apologize for the small print on this slide, but it illustrates how historical trauma impacts Native individuals, families, and communities in deeply interconnected ways. At the individual level, it can show up as substance use, disconnection from identity, and unresolved grief. And these aren't just personal struggles, they often reflect broader historical and generational pain. And in families, we see that trauma can disrupt roles, weaken bonds, and interrupt the passing down of parenting practices and cultural values. And then down at that community level, we see the efforts in lateral violence, health disparities, economic oppression, loss of sovereignty, and severed relationships with institutions like education, healthcare, and government. And this framework is grounded in the work of Dr. Tessa Evans Campbell, a citizen of the Choctaw Nation and a nationally respected scholar on historical trauma. Her research has been instrumental in helping us understand how trauma, rooted in colonization, boarding schools, and cultural loss, continues to shape the mental health, relational dynamics, and resilience of Native peoples today. Dr. Evans Campbell's work emphasizes that the impact of historical trauma is not just historical, it's ongoing. And understanding this is essential if we want to build relationships, systems, and support networks that truly honor Native experiences and promote healing. This slide here brings us to the concept of systemic trauma that's embedded in institutions, policies, and structures that continue to affect our Native communities today. Treaties, which were meant to honor tribal sovereignty, have been repeatedly broken by the US government. Many of those treaties included education as a guaranteed right, but instead of providing opportunity, the education system became a tool of assimilation and cultural loss. Boarding schools, compulsory schooling laws, and forced removal from families were also part of this design. These systems inflicted trauma on every level, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. The result has been generations of pain and disconnection, but also resilience in the face of continued injustice. Understanding systemic trauma helps us see that this isn't just about individual experiences, it's about structures that were designed to break down identity, community, and wellness. So current trauma, up to this point, we've been talking about historical trauma, but it's important, but it's important to remember that trauma is not only in the past. American Indian Alaska Native communities still experience trauma today in the form of that poverty, systemic racism, family separation, environmental injustice, violence, and ongoing erasure. These aren't just historical wounds, they're really present day realities that we face. If we don't acknowledge these current harms, they'll eventually become tomorrow's historical trauma, and the cycle will continue. At the same time, we expect today's systems, schools, child welfare, and behavioral health to support Native children and families in meaningful ways. But we often ask those systems to address not only current challenges, but also the weight of past traumas and vicarious trauma, without always equipping them with the knowledge, tools, or cultural grounding needed to respond effectively. So the challenge before us is this: how do we recognize and respond to trauma in real time, so we aren't simply repeating the conditions that caused it in the first place? And how can we better support Native families by building systems that acknowledge historical truth, honor culture, and support healing across generations? And this next piece is a poem that was written in response to a deeply harmful public comment that was very recent. A political commentator, Ann Coulter, said, "We didn't kill enough Indians." Rather than respond with anger, this poet answers with love, survival, and cultural pride, reminding us that presence itself is a powerful act of resistance. We were passing the dinner plate, beans still warm, the laughter of my son just teasing the dogs during dinner time, when the words came. Not from a history book, not whispered in the corner of an old treaty, but loud, public, as if she were telling us that we should have never made it to this table. We didn't kill enough Indians, she said on the news, and my son's eyes, wide like the sky, froze mid-bite. My youngest asked, "Are they talking about us?" "Yes, baby, they are. They mean the braids you wear with pride, the syllables of your name, the language we sing before meals, the buffalo we pray for. They mean this land, this laugh, this lineage. They mean our continuance." I wanted to howl, but I did not. I lifted the spoon again, I poured them more to eat, and I told them, "She does not get to finish the story. We are still here, still eating, still loving, still rising like smoke from every fire that tried to stamp out. You are not a mistake. You are the answer, and no voice of hatred can undo the miracle of your being. So eat, my children, with joy, with honor, with love that feeds you like corn. We are not ghosts. We are the heartbeat they can never silence." This poem is a reminder that we're still here, not just surviving, but loving, parenting, and carrying forward the stories they tried to erase. And as we move forward, may we center that truth, that Native continuance is not a relic of the past. It's happening every day around our kitchen tables, in our classrooms, and in our communities. And this poem was circulating around Facebook. And thank you guys for your comments. But this quote that she said about "we didn't kill enough Indians" reminded me of one of the last elections when they called us, what did they say? Oh, it was that we were other, that we weren't even included in the votes. And then instead of characters, one of the news commenters called us creatures. So that was a meme for a while in our community. We kind of made a laugh about it. You have to laugh about it or you'll cry about it. So yeah, I saw a lot of beautiful creature memes going around that one year. Um, and yeah, it's been wild hearing some of the comments that have come out in our current communities in our current state today. So how does historical trauma impact how we do our work today? When we engage with our Native communities today, whether it's in education, healthcare, social services, or community work, it's essential to understand how historical trauma shapes those relationships. And one of the biggest challenges that you're going to face, and that any of us face, is mistrust in our systems. And that mistrust isn't irrational or personal, it's the result of generations of harm that was caused by broken treaties, boarding schools, forced removals, and that systemic neglect. Many Native individuals and families are still carrying that weight. So we're not starting from a blank slate. We're often starting from a place of repair. Every interaction we have is a chance to rebuild trust. It may be small, a phone call, a meeting, a referral, but it matters. These moments are opportunities for connection, accountability, and healing. Another impact of historical trauma is the disruption of our cultural knowledge. Some of our community members may hold and share deep traditions, while others may have lost access due to those forced assimilation or generational silence. There can also be hesitation to share cultural knowledge if people feel it may be misunderstood or misappropriated. By recognizing this context, we approach our work with more cultural humility, deeper respect, and a greater ability to support Native families and communities in a way that centers dignity, history, and healing. It's also important to remember that responses to historical trauma vary widely person to person. Not everyone will react in the same way or even recognize that what they're feeling is trauma. A person's response can be shaped by many factors like their age, developmental stage, knowledge of tribal history, personal or family experiences, and access to healing or support. Some individuals may carry a deep awareness of how historical trauma has impacted them, while others may not yet have the language or understanding, or may not want to talk about it at all, but they also might not be ready to talk about it. And that's why we must approach each person with empathy and humility, recognizing that the response is shaped by many layers that we may not see. And also not just the individual level, but every family is going to have a different experience and every community is going to have a different experience through all of these federal policies and histories that have occurred. And so now that we've explored some of those roots and impacts of historical trauma, the next step is asking, how do we apply this lens to the work that we do today? When we bring a historical trauma lens into our work, it shifts how we interpret what we see. Instead of viewing challenges like substance use, disengagement, or academic struggle as individual shortcomings, we start asking different questions. What systems shaped these outcomes? How might historical and intergenerational trauma be influencing this person's experience? And what has this community survived and what is still being carried? This lens helps us move from judgment to understanding. It reminds us that behaviors we may view as problems could actually be responses to deep-rooted pain. Pain that didn't start with the individual, but lives in the systems and stories around them. Using this perspective doesn't excuse harm, but it does give us a more complete view. And with that, the chance to respond with empathy, humility, and healing-centered care. So using a historical trauma lens means shifting the way we view behaviors, not just in individuals, but in families and communities. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, we begin to ask what's happened to you. This shift in perspective helps us move away from blame and towards curiosity, empathy, and understanding. And it doesn't just apply to our youth and our families, it applies to the caregivers, the entire community. When a caregiver seems disengaged or reactive, we can ask, what's happened to this caregiver? And when we see patterns in a community, we can ask, what's happened to this community? And by asking these questions, we acknowledge that trauma, especially historical and intergenerational trauma, can shape how people respond to the world. And when we understand that, we're better equipped to meet people where they are with care and cultural humility. Alrighty, welcome back. I promise that the rest of these slides will be a little bit more uplifting as we are going to be talking about healing and resilience. And the photo in the background is one of my favorite places in the world to go drive through. This is Looking Glass Pass near Glacier National Park, just outside of East Glacier, Montana, just off of the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. And you get some really great colors and sights during sunrise and sunset. So moving into this next section, we've spent some time exploring the roots and impacts of historical trauma, how it affects individuals, families, and communities across generations. But it's equally important to recognize that trauma is not the whole story. Alongside grief and loss, there's always been resilience, and our Native communities have held on to our culture, language, relationships, and ways of healing, even in the face of enormous adversity. So this next section is about hope. It's about the strength that exists in our communities, the healing that's already happening, and the tools that we can uplift and support, both in our work and our relationships. We'll explore what healing looks like when it's culturally grounded, community-led, and rooted in truth. So as we talk about healing and resilience, it's important to remember that just as adverse experiences can shape a child's life, so can those positive ones. This slide highlights positive childhood experiences or PACEs, things like feeling safe at home, having a trusted adult, or feeling connected to culture and community. This was a 2019 study by Bethel, published in JAMA Pediatrics, found that PACEs are strongly associated with better mental health outcomes, even in the presence of adversity. So in other words, children who experience trauma but also have strong positive experiences are more likely to thrive. These protective experiences buffer the impact of toxic stress and support long-term well-being. For Native children and families, these PACEs can look like strong connections to cultural identity and traditional practices, time spent with extended family and elders, belonging to a close-knit community, and feeling seen, heard, and supported by caring adults. And the research is clear: investing in protective relationships and cultural belonging is just as important as reducing risk. So this slide is inspired by the work of Dr. Megan Rides at the Door, who reminds us that while we talk a lot about the adverse childhood experiences, there's also that other side of the pyramid, one rooted in healing, protection, and strength. We know the original ACEs framework focuses on risk and adversity, but if that's all we focus on, we're only telling half the story. Dr. Writes at the Door encourages us to ask, what protective experiences did a child have? What does their community offer in terms of strength, support, and identity? And what role does cultural connection play in buffering against trauma? On this other side, we see connection to culture and ceremony, supportive relationships with family and elders and community, language revitalization, land-based healing, and spiritual grounding. Systems that acknowledge historical trauma and build trust through respect and inclusion. This perspective reminds us resilience isn't about bouncing back from trauma alone. It's about being rooted in something strong enough to carry you through. And when we design systems of care, education, or support, we need to ask, are we investing as much in building up the protective side as we are in naming the risks? So this model is called the Indigenous Wellness Pyramid. It was developed by Dr. Megan Writes at the Door and Dr. Nancy Lucero Shaw. It was created as a culturally grounded framework for understanding trauma, healing, and wellness in our Indigenous communities. The pyramid is built on the belief that wellness is more than the absence of illness. It's rooted in cultural identity and community connection and spiritual strength. Where the traditional ACEs pyramid focused on the buildup of risk and harm over time, this pyramid offers a pathway back to balance, drawing from Indigenous knowledge systems, values, and ways of being. Key components of the model are historical trauma acknowledgement, protective and cultural factors, relational healing, collective thriving. And this model reminds us that healing in Native communities can't come solely from Western clinical models. It must include cultural teachings, lived wisdom, and the voices of Native people themselves. It's not just a response to trauma, it's a map towards restoration, resilience, and cultural continuity. So let's talk about resilience, a term that gets used a lot, but often means different things in different contexts. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines resilience as a dynamic developmental process, not just a trait or a personality type. It's about the ability to adapt in healthy ways despite adversity. Healthy adaptation often means reaching developmental milestones that are appropriate for a child's age and stage. And for young children, this might be learning to walk or talk. For adolescents, it could be finishing school, forming relationships, or discovering a sense of identity and purpose. But resilience also looks different from child to child, especially when you factor in culture, environment, and access to support. Two youth might experience the same trauma, but how they respond can vary based on their relationships, their traditions, and protective factors that are around them. Newer understandings of resilience also include the sustainment of well-being, not just bouncing back, but staying grounded and whole over time, especially when life continues to be difficult. So as we move into this next section on healing and strengths, we're thinking about resilience as something that's built, supported, nourished, especially through culture, connection, and relational care. Great. So resilience, the ability of American Indians to maintain optimism during adversity is related to spirituality, compassion, empathy, humor, friendships, and familial and community strengths. It's defined here as a positive adaptive response in the face of significant adversity. This comes from the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, and it's a helpful way to think about what resilience really means in our work. It's not something you're either born with or without. Resilience can exist naturally. It can be built, and it can also erode when the environment doesn't support healing. That's why it matters so much to create systems and relationships that nurture resilience, especially in communities carrying the weight of historical and ongoing trauma. It's also a reminder that resilience isn't just about ignoring pain. It's about having the support, tools, and connection to move through it. So next we'll watch this short video. It's from the series Reservation Dogs that was on FX, and it's still available on Hulu. If you haven't watched it, I highly encourage you to go take a look. It's definitely a contemporary, current series that is really relatable to me as a millennial and some of our older generations as well. So I really appreciate that clip. One of my colleagues used it for another presentation, and it really shows that example of a protective factor of having that trusted adult, that even though it was her aunt who was in jail, that she was still able to go to her and seek that guidance. Um, and then also the like active offering, uh, having an offering for that guidance, that reciprocity of like, I'll provide you with something because I'm asking you of something. That's really core belief in some of our communities. And then the image of her ancestors behind her and supporting her and still providing that love and that guidance even in her activities as a youth that day. So that leads us into our protective factors, and these are the relationships, the cultural practices, and the spiritual connections that support healing and wellness in our communities. Relationships with those caring adults or elders, connection to community and land, cultural identity that affirms who you are and where you come from, language which carries values, teachings, and ways of knowing, ceremony that grounds us, and spirituality, however it's practiced, that helps people feel rooted and whole. These are the things that help buffer the impact of trauma and create a space for resilience, belonging, and hope. As helpers, educators, and system workers, one of the most powerful things that we can do is nurture these protective factors, not just as a response to trauma, but also as a way to actively support them thriving. So research consistently shows that resilience is built through relationships. In fact, the most powerful and well-documented protective factor for children who face adversity is having at least one stable, supportive relationship with an adult they trust. This could be a parent, but it could also be a grandparent, auntie, teacher, coach, or family friend. What matters most isn't the role, it's the quality of that connection. Is it safe? Is it consistent? Is it rooted in love, guidance, and trust? These relationships help buffer children from the harmful effects of stress. They provide emotional safety and co-regulation, which helps children build the skills they need to adapt, even in difficult environments. In Native communities, this truth aligns with long-standing cultural values. Our kinship systems, our clan systems, our extended family roles. These are Indigenous protective factors that have existed long before the term resilience was ever used. While trauma can disrupt some relationships, healing also begins through relationships. And in many tribal communities, the potential for support is strong because of that tight-knit social fabric that already existed. So when we ask how to help children heal, we don't have to start with a program, we start with a person. And as I've said throughout this presentation, while trauma can be passed down, so can the strength. And in Indigenous communities, that strength often lives in what we call protective factors. These are those cultural practices, relationships, values, and ways of being. What's powerful about our Indigenous protective factors is that they're community-based, relational, and often tied to land, language, and tradition. They don't just reduce harm, they actively promote well-being, identity, and belonging. Another protective factor is the opportunity to build mastery, to grow a sense of confidence, capability, and purpose. For our children and youth, this often comes through cultural practices, responsibilities, and land-based learning. Whether it's helping in the garden, learning to bead, riding horses, participating in ceremony, or helping care for younger relatives, these experiences build not just skills, but also a sense of self-worth and belonging. Mastery isn't just about academic or athletic achievement. It's about knowing that you're capable, that your contribution matters, and that your identity is a source of strength. And when they feel confident in who they are and what they can do, they are better equipped to cope with stress, navigate challenges, and stay connected to culture. So again, with the resilience, we often think about individuals, but resilience can also be collective. Community and cultural resilience refers to the strength that emerges from being a part of a people who with shared stories, traditions, values, and ways of being. Indigenous communities have shown remarkable resilience through generations of disruption, violence, and forced assimilation. Despite that, our languages are still spoken. Our ceremonies are still practiced. Our children are still dancing. This kind of resilience is deeply rooted in relationships, in connection to land, in cultural practices, and in the power of intergenerational knowledge. In this image, we see my daughter when she was about a year and a half, looking up, learning, watching, absorbing. And that's how cultural resilience is passed on, hand in hand, moment by moment. It lives in our powwows, our feast days, our naming ceremonies, our family gatherings, and even in everyday acts of caregiving and storytelling. This is important because culture itself is a protective factor. It helps buffer that impact of trauma. It restores our identity, and it reminds us that we belong to something greater than ourselves. So in this next section, we'll go over some considerations for working with our American Indian and Alaska Native communities. It's not a checklist or a one-size-fits-all guide. Every tribal nation and every Indigenous community is unique with their own protocols, their own values, and their own histories. But what we can do is approach our work with respect, humility, and a willingness to listen and learn. So as we begin to think about how to work in a good way with our communities, it's essential to recognize the foundational values that guide many of the Indigenous worldviews. These values may look different across tribal nations, but there are common threads that show up in how relationships, time, and the world around us are understood. The universe is viewed as interdependent. Everything is connected. The people, animals, plants, water, and even inanimate things like stones and mountains. There's a strong emphasis on maintaining balance, harmony, and mutual respect. This means that any disruption in one part of the system impacts the whole. Family extends far beyond the nuclear model. It often includes extended relatives, adopted kin, clan, and band members, and community ties. Family is where identity, purpose, direction, and belonging are shaped. Being part of a family, however it's defined, is considered a source of strength, support, and prosperity. Elders and children hold sacred roles. Elders are the keepers of knowledge and are to be honored for their wisdom and lived experience. Children are deeply valued as carriers of future generations and are often seen as closest to the spiritual realm. Both are to be protected, listened to, and respected. And time is understood differently. Rather than operating on rigid schedules or urgency, there's the belief that things will happen when they're supposed to. This view of time supports patience, presence, and trust in natural processes. Important to remember when working with community members who may have different expectations around timing, deadlines, or decision making. Holding these understandings helps us approach relationships and partnerships with deeper respect and cultural humility. So this slide invites us to shift our focus kind of outward from centering ourselves to truly honoring the experiences of others. Cultural humility calls us to approach every interaction with deep respect, recognizing the wisdom, strength, and value in each person's lived experience. It means letting go of assumptions of expertise or superiority and showing up as learners, not just as helpers. Rather than rushing to interpret someone's behavior, we pause and ask, what might be behind that choice? This mindset helps us stay open and curious, especially when something challenges our own worldview. In its core, cultural humility is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique. After a conversation or encounter, we might ask ourselves, where did I stay too comfortable in my own lens? What perspectives might I have missed? And being open to new ideas, especially those that challenge our norms or our beliefs, is essential. When we encounter cultural practices or worldviews that are unfamiliar or different, we resist the urge to judge and instead let those moments deepen our understanding. It's natural to feel defensive when our assumptions are questioned, but noticing that reaction, I'm feeling protective of my perspective right now, can be the first step towards growth. And sometimes we may hear feedback like, you didn't quite get it. Rather than resisting, we can choose to receive that as a gift, an invitation to learn more, listen more deeply, and do better next time. So as we continue today and continue our journeys, let's carry that spirit of humility with us, staying curious, being open to feedback, and always remaining committed to growth, not just professionally, but personally and relationally as well. And this slide just introduces the principles of trauma-informed care, which include that history and culture, Going over safety, making sure that people feel physically and emotionally safe to heal. Having trust, we know that it takes time, especially in communities that have experienced betrayal and harm by systems. Having peer support, healing is supported by connection. Peers, those who have similar lived experiences, can offer empathy, cultural understanding, and non-judgmental support. Having mutual collaboration. This principle emphasizes shared power. Families and communities are not just recipients of services, they are experts in their own lives. Collaborating means respecting the expertise and working towards solutions together. And voice and choice. We ensure that people have a voice in their own care and that services are flexible and responsive to individual needs, culture, and preferences. Healing is not a one-size-fits-all. True empowerment comes from honoring choice. And again, these principles aren't just boxes to check. They're a mindset. And when trauma-informed care is grounded in Indigenous wisdom and cultural humility, it becomes a powerful tool for relationships, restoration, and resilience. This slide highlights one of the most foundational aspects of healing work, having safety and trust of people needing to feel that physically and psychologically safe when receiving services or staff from an organization, and that all the planning and decisions are conducted with transparency and with the goal of building and maintaining trust among staff, children, and families. We also want to meet the family and youth where they are, recognizing that Native families are very diverse, that families living in the same community may be culturally different, that cultural humility means having the family teach you about them, their beliefs, and their dynamics as an individual family and not using generalized stereotypes that we may have heard in the community. Also having a cultural lens versus a Western lens in working with tribal families and being aware of kinship, some of those extended family members, cultural adoptions, and clans that might be the family's natural support system. And then family-driven care, which is a practice that's rooted in restoring voice, power, and sovereignty to families and their communities. And when we say family-driven, we mean more than just including families in conversations. We mean centering them in the decision-making process. Families should have their own primary role in guiding not only the care of their own children, but also in shaping the systems and policies that affect their broader community. And then here's something that might be new to some people. It's youth-guided care, a practice that's essential to any healing-centered and culturally responsive system. Youth-guided means more than just listening to the young people when it's convenient to you. It means empowering them, educating them, and giving them meaningful decision-making roles in their lives and in the systems that serve all youth in the communities. This principle recognizes that young people are not just future leaders, they're leaders right now. They have insight, creativity, and lived experience that needs to be centered in everything from service planning to policy development. But being youth guided also means creating safe and supportive spaces where young people feel like they belong, where their voices are truly heard, and where they can build confidence and self-determination. In our communities, this includes honoring cultural identities, spiritual values, and traditional ways of learning and leading. Importantly, youth-guided care recognizes that power should be shared. Adults don't disappear from the process, and they become partners, mentors, and guides, helping youth step into leadership in a way that aligns with their readiness, maturity, and their strengths. And let's not forget, youth-guided work should be engaging, relational, and joyful. It's not about tokenizing youth involvement, but about building something with them that is sustainable, relevant, and reflects the truth of their experiences. So when we think about supporting Indigenous youth in healing and growth, this approach reminds us that empowerment starts with trust, voice, and opportunity. And this slide shows that when we think about family engagement, especially in Native communities, we often need to reframe it, how it's approached, both in mindset and in practice. So going from individual responsibility to shared responsibility, random acts to systemic acts, add-on to integration, event-driven to learning and outcome-driven. And this is how we move from inviting families to working alongside them with respect, reciprocity, and commitment to doing better together. And also family involvement and family engagement. And the difference is more than just the wording. Involvement often means the ideas and direction come from the agency or institution. It's when we say we're involving them, but really we're asking families to participate in ways we've already defined. Sign this paper, attend this event, complete this task. It's often agency led and task based. And while the intention may be good, it doesn't always build connection or trust, especially for families who've experienced harm or exclusion in these systems. Engagement, on the other hand, is about partnership, the energy and ideas that are elicited from families. We ask what matters to you, what would be meaningful, what collaboration would look like for you. It's relational and not transactional. And we want to focus on their strengths. What do they already do well, and what supports do they have? We want to focus on their needs and not their problems. And we also want to incorporate and integrate their cultural beliefs and their value systems as well. And also going from offering multiple communication methods to working together with families to design methods and processes that work for them. And then that one-on-one relationship building. Even the simple thing of remembering names and the tribe that they belong to goes a long way. Asking how they're doing genuinely, and not just as a formality, but with presence. Sharing something about yourself. Relationships are reciprocal. When you share a little bit about who you are, it allows others to feel more comfortable and connected. And following through. When you say you're going to do something, get it done and make sure that you do it to show that accountability and that you're there for them. Also, don't be afraid to be your authentic self. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be honest, respectful, and willing to learn. People will connect with your sincerity more than with your credentials. And another way of engaging with our youth and families is promoting protective cultural factors. Create opportunities for families to reclaim their traditional ways. Look to local nations or tribes for them to connect with their community. Integrate healing practices, traditional ways of knowing, and language in their care plans. And then also be open to families engaging in services that are most appropriate to them and support their connection with nature and ceremony. Sorry, we've got a minute left. I'm trying to get through these slides, and I know she put them in the chat as well. Um, well, this is the family voice and choice, that mutual collaboration again, including peer supports that we went over with trauma-informed care, and then walking us alongside one another. Rather than handing over a treatment plan, invite families to co-create those treatment plans, asking what their goals are, what approaches feel right to them, and also what supports already exist in their circle. And then some of the personal strategies, be willing to know or acknowledge your lack of knowledge of their culture. Be interested in learning about them. Understand the differences between American Indian people in their level of identification and connectedness to their culture, even from reservations, and continue to examine your own worldview. Right, and then these are some community engagement strategies. Being intentional about learning about your community and the tribe in your local area, building relationships with the tribal members, building partnerships with formal and informal service providers. A lot of our communities have a lot of nonprofits. There's different grant services within, especially behavioral health programs and education systems, juvenile justice systems. Identify cultural resources for families. Do some of that resource sharing within the community. And if you don't know what they are, then go and seek the local tribal programs in your community to find out. And also the biggest one that I can't even emphasize enough is to participate in those community gatherings. Be present in the community that you're serving. Attend the powwows, go to the fairs, attend the feasts if you're invited. Attend the local Indian rodeos in your area if you have any. You actually have a lot in California. My husband's a wild horse racer, and his team goes down to California a lot to compete. Then also attend some of those community and school sponsored events to be a presence in your community and build that relationship with the community outside of your service position and your role in the community. Also practice building those authentic relationships. make sure they're sustainable, that it's mutually benefit and reciprocal for the community, because that's what our tribal communities are expecting from you as well. And then some of those tips for asking questions: ask for instructions on how things might work best, ask open-ended questions. Nothing can replace sincerity and kindness. Listen closely, slow down, relax, and be calm, and also be open-minded to learning. And then practice developing Indigenous literacy. Devote time and resources to build basic knowledge, learn about the history, culture, and experiences, identify whether a community has one or more tribes represented, and rely on primary sources of information. There's lots of information out there, but I urge you to be careful in some of that information that you seek. So, and then as we move towards those healing approaches, acknowledge and depathologize historical trauma. The trauma is there, but so is that resiliency and healing. We want to shift the narrative to recognize that those strengths have been passed down to our community members, and then also remember that healing supports future generations. And these are some helpful resources that you might look to for further information: local tribal colleges, Native American studies departments, tribal museums, cultural centers, elders, cultural and language teachers, and even urban Indian centers in your area. And then as we quickly wrap up, these are some final reminders to carry with you, whether you're partnering with tribal programs, supporting Native children and families, or stepping into a new relationship with community. First, practice what we call a rigid state of flexibility. Be clear in your purpose, but flexible in your process. We also have to think about building staff and program capacity. Long-term impact comes not just from meeting immediate needs, but from investing in the sustainability and strength of tribal systems. Be willing to change processes, especially when tribal partners express a different need, priority, or way of doing things. And if there's one thing we hope you walk away with, it's this: relationship, relationship, relationship. Tribal leaders, staff, and caregivers are not looking for temporary outreach. They're looking for trust and consistency, and for allies who are in it for the long haul. Engagement, when done well, can be its own form of ceremony. It's sacred, it's relational, and it's also healing for everyone involved. We must acknowledge that we are all related. When one child is hurt, we all hurt, and the opposite is true as well. When one child is protected and loved, put in a place of honor, we all benefit. And then some closing thoughts for that ongoing commitment to enhancing one's own knowledge and embodying cultural humility. Remember, it's not only what we do, but how we do it. If we have a strategy we are implementing, it should feel healing in our processes. We need to move out of that systemic crisis mode to be intentional, and think about what you'll do with what you've heard today. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat. Also, if you are interested in any further trainings, you can reach out to our center. We provide free TTA training and technical assistance to communities, community programs, any program that would like further training on trauma-informed care and historical trauma.
Sorry, I was finishing up putting something in the chat. Thank you so much for being here today. And this training was absolutely incredible. I know it's something that is near and dear to my heart and something that I enjoy learning about. And so I wanted to thank everybody for being here today. I wanted to drop, oh, perfect. Lana dropped our calendar in the chat if you want to go take a look at any of our other trainings that we have coming up. So we wanted to thank you all for being here and having the space to move through all the information today, doing the breakout room, participating in the chat. We really, really enjoyed it, and we love the engagement when we're talking to you all and discussing these topics. So that will be the end of our training today. I hope you have a great day. It's almost the weekend. And so thank you so much for being here today. And again, thank you so much, Andrea.
Yep, thank you all.
Yeah, have a great day.